The three sons of Edelgard began their final agonizingly slow crawl into alignment, casting long, overlapping shadows of amber and violet across the great atrium of Station Unity. High above the sprawling flora, the sky was a bruised masterpiece of shifting color, the triple dawn sunset that arrived once every 50 years. It was the celestial heart of the convergence, a rare witness to a peace 3,000 years in the making. The air was thick with the scent of blooming star lilies and the melodic chime of glass bells, creating an atmosphere of ethereal calm. To the thousands of gathered citizens, the station was a fortress of stability. But 40 levels below, in the humid, oil-slicked silence of the maintenance shafts, Soran watched a thermal monitor with predatory focus. He wasn't just adjusting dials, he was nesting. Tucked deep within the primary structural housing of the station's spine, his team was busy welding the main payload, the one meant for the summit. To mask the massive energy draw required to prime the plasma cores, they had tapped into the secondary power relays, causing the station's grid to groan. "The humans are late," his operative hissed, frantically shielding the glow of a welder as a security drone buzzed far down the corridor. "Their arrogance is our window," Soran replied, not looking up from his work. "Every minute they stall is a minute the Federation spends looking at empty docking bays, instead of us. The power fluctuations are spiking. They'll trace this back in minutes," the operative countered, his voice tight with nerves. "Then give them a bone to gnaw on," Soran replied, pointing to a corroded power relay nearby. "Overload that relay. They'll fix it and move on. We need them to look the other way." He keyed a command, intentionally blowing the old relay. A shower of sparks rained down, and a rhythmic subsonic pulse began to thrum through the deck plates. Up in the atrium, Councillor Elara moved through the crowd, her movements graceful as the iridescent ribbons of the Lightweavers drifted overhead. She stopped near a cluster of glass vines to watch a group of children chasing snapfires that popped into harmless golden sparks at a touch. A small child with wide, luminous eyes accidentally bumped into her, his static orb dissipating against her sleeve. Elara knelt, her expression softening into a genuine smile. She reached out with a hand that bore the faint glowing tracery of communion mark's silvery scars from her years spent mediating planetary disputes. She gently tapped his shoulder. "The festival is for everyone," she said warmly. "Don't let a few sparks slow you down." As she stood, an elderly merchant with skin like cracked obsidian stepped into her path. His internal core was dimming in a visible sign of anxiety as the lights in his stall flickered and died. "Councillor," the elder said, his voice raspy, "the lower levels are losing power. Is this display worth a blackout?" Elara placed a steady hand on the merchant's arm. As she did, she closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, her communion marks flaring slightly as she felt the station's pulse through the soles of her feet. The vibration was wrong, a jagged artificial hitch in the station's breath. "The strain is temporary, there's nothing to worry about," she replied softly, her voice carrying the practiced weight of a woman used to calming entire worlds. "Please enjoy the festival, we'll have it fixed soon." The merchant moved back into the crowd, eased by her words. But the second he was gone, Elara's smile vanished as she turned to Kaelin. He was already standing a half-step behind her, his hand resting habitually on the hilt of his sidearm. His eyes, which moved independently like a predator's, scanning the upper balconies for threats he could feel, but not yet see. "Get a team down to secondary maintenance," she whispered, her voice low and dangerously sharp. "Find the problem and fix it." Kaelin gave a sharp nod, his scales darkening to a deep, tactical charcoal, a biological reflex to stress. He pulled 2 technicians away from the perimeter and slipped through the service door, leaving the amber glow of the triple dawn for the sterile, metallic chill of the maintenance corridors. As they descended, the distant music of the wind harps was replaced by a low-frequency thrum that Kaelin could feel in his teeth. He adjusted his grip on his scanner, his movements economical and precise. They reached secondary maintenance, where the lights flickered rhythmically. His team found the corroded relay Soran had sabotaged. It was arc-welding itself to the strut, sending vibrations through the deck. "It's a blown relay," the technician reported, wiping sweat from his brow. "Old model. It must have seized up when the power spiked. It was shorting against the struts, making it look like a bigger drain than it is." Kalen just didn't take his word for it. He leaned in, his independent eyes focusing on the burn marks, searching for signs of tampering. Finding only the jagged melt of a natural short, he relaxed just enough. "Fix it," he ordered. With a few quick commands, the technician bypassed the faulty relay. The deep hum immediately smoothed out into a gentle purr. The flickering lights began to stabilize. Kalen keyed his comlink. "Counselor, we've found the source. Just a piece of neglected hardware. The lights are back to full power." Ilara exhaled, the silver light in her communion marks dimming to a calm, steady glow. "Good work, but ensure maintenance does a double sweep just in case. We can't afford any more accidents." Down in the dark, Soran watched his monitor as the security team fixed the decoy. He sat in total silence, his hand resting on the bulkhead that hid the real bomb. A thin, cold smile touched his lips. "They've bypassed the decoy," the operative whispered from the shadows. "They think the threat is gone." "Good," Soran replied. "Let them report a job well done." Up in the atrium, the lights brightened to full power. The merchant looked up, saw the steady glow, and offered Ilara a grateful nod. The crisis, it seemed, was over. The following morning, the amber hues of the triple dawn had deepened into a brilliant crystalline gold. Ilara made her way toward the observation deck, her footsteps echoing softly on the translucent floor plates. From this height, the great atrium was a sprawling sea of colour, a living tapestry of alien life and flourishing greenery. Below, the festival was reaching its fever pitch. Thousands of delegates and citizens moved through the winding garden paths, their voices rising in a harmonic hum that bypassed the station's dampeners. The snapfires from the night before had been replaced by soaring glow kites, tethered ribbons of light that danced in the artificial thermals. Ilara reached the edge of the reinforced glass, her communion marks shimmering faintly against the cold surface as she looked out over the reach of her station. Kalen was there, standing like a silent sentinel at the railing, his independent eyes tracking the movement of a security drone. "The merchant from last night sent a gift," Kalen said without turning, his voice to a low rumble. "A flask of pressed star lily nectar. He seems convinced you personally wrestled the power grid back to life." Ilara allowed a small, tired smile to touch her lips. "I'll take the credit if it keeps the peace, Kalen. How is the deck?" "Stable. Quiet," he replied, finally looking at her. His scales were a calm, neutral teal, though he still stood with a tension that suggested he hadn't slept. "The repair to that relay held perfectly." Ilara nodded, looking past the greenery and the crowds towards the vast starlit vacuum beyond the dome. "It's too quiet. This summit will change the galaxy forever, and the station is acting like it's a simple holiday." "Is that a bad thing?" Kalen asked. "In my experience, the silence is usually just a breath before the scream," she whispered. She looked down, watching the nectar in her glass vibrate ever so slightly. "They aren't late, they're making us wait. It's a tactical choice." 40 levels below, Soran stood in the oppressive heat of the secondary maintenance crawlspace, staring at the same stars through a narrow reinforced viewport. He wasn't celebrating but counting down the time dot behind him. His operative worked in total silence, fine-tuning the frequency of the real resonators. "The decoy was bypassed 3 hours ago," the operative whispered, his hands steady as he adjusted a thermal shroud. "The security teams are satisfied. They think the glitch is gone." Soran didn't look back. Good. Let them feel safe. Safety makes people heavy and slow. He watched the empty space where the human fleet was expected to emerge. For Soran, this attack, it was meant to force the Federation to see humanity for what they truly were: monsters. His team had spent months mapping the station's core, finding the exact harmonic points where a plasma surge wouldn't just cause a blackout, it would cause a structural collapse. Suddenly, the sensor slate in his hand shrieked a warning. The starfield on his monitor rippled, then tore open. "They're here," Soran muttered, his predatory focus sharpening. The operative paused, looking at the massive energy signatures blooming on the display. That's too much mass. That's a combat formation." Soran watched the icons of the Alexander and its escorts blink into existence. A lesser man would have panicked, fearing his plan was compromised, but Soran simply smiled, a thin, cold line across his face. "It changes nothing. Let the humans bring their iron. It only gives us more to bury." He keyed a private channel to his other cells hidden throughout the station. "Stay dark. Do not engage. Let the peace break itself. We trigger on my mark." Up in the atrium, the peace broke not with a sound, but with a sickening pressure in the inner ear. It was a phantom weight that turned the nectar in Ilara's glass into a violent geometric pattern and stole the breath from the guests below. In an instant, the harmony of the gardens was replaced by the brittle snapping of crystalline harp strings as they shattered under a sudden, invisible gravitational surge. A jagged, pale fracture split the starfield, hemorrhaging a light that washed out the amber sunset and drowned the atrium in a sickly, bruised purple. The station's structural alarms began a rhythmic wail as the atmosphere was pulled towards the docking pylons. The internal systems groaned, fighting to compensate for the massive shadow manifesting out of the void. Then the sky broke when the TSS Alexander shoved its way through. It was a 5-kilometer slab of matte black tungsten, a geometric void that blotted out the suns. This was the Alexander, the heart of the formation, a carrier designed to project the Terran will across entire star systems. Along its flanks, the massive launch gills were already glowing with the standby heat of its drone bays, a predatory hum that buried the silence of the crowd. Flanking the carrier were the twin hammers of the fleet, the Agincourt and Bismarck. These two massive battleships looked as though they had been hewn from solid obsidian, their hulls dominated by siege weapons designed to turn moons into debris. A screen of Vindicator-class destroyers zipped around the heavy vessels like wolves guarding a pack, their sensor arrays aggressively painting every Federation vessel in the vicinity. The mass of the battle group caused the station to tilt. In the atrium, decorations were torn from the trees by the sudden gravitational shift. Children screamed in genuine terror, a discordant mix of vocal cords, melodic trills, and frantic clicking. The pale-skinned heiress guests struggled to keep their balance as their hollow bones vibrated with the station's groan, while the bioluminescent markings on the skin of the deep dwellers flared a panicked strobe-like red. The arrival of the Alexander culminated in a violent physical event. When its massive gravity anchors bit into the docking ring, the impact sent a shudder through the station's very spine. A deep, metallic groan vibrated up through the floor of the observation tier. Beside Councillor Ilara, Kalen's hand trembled as he lowered his data slate. The fine interlocking scales on the backs of his knuckles bristled slightly, a physiological tell he couldn't quite suppress. The polished, professional mask he'd worn all morning was gone. "This isn't a delegation," he whispered, his eyes locked on the Bismarck's main batteries. From their vantage point, they could see the massive triple barrels rotating with predatory slowness, ranging toward the station's primary power core. The carrier loomed over them, its shadow finally touching the glass, drowning the festival in a cold, artificial twilight. The nectar in Ilara's glass surged over the rim, staining the white marble of the balcony like a fresh wound. She looked up at the Alexander and realized that the victory she had planned for looked exactly like an invasion. Against the carrier's hull, a single black shuttle detached from a side berth. "Go," Elara commanded, her voice cold and sharp. She didn't look at him. Greet them. Find out if we are hosting guests or conquerors. Kaelin was moving before she even finished the sentence. He adjusted his cuff, signaled for the private lift, and was gone. Kilometers below, the black transport's heavy assault ramp slammed onto the primary docking deck. Kaelin was already there. While the junior diplomat stood with pale faces, he remained still. A calm, professional anchor. A squad of Terran shock troopers marched out first. They were massive men, their presence alone forcing the terrified staff to retreat into the shadows. Then, High Admiral Valerius stepped out. He wore a charcoal black officer's uniform, tailored with such lethal precision it looked like an extension of the ship itself. He walked with a heavy, measured stride, the gait of a man who knew that every gun in the sector was slave to his whim. Kaelin stepped forward to meet him halfway. His vertical slitted pupils narrowed slightly as he adjusted to the Admiral's presence, but he offered a deep, respectful bow. "High Admiral Valerius," he said as he straightened. "I am Kaelin, primary aide to the Councillor. She is expecting you. I have secured the Central Express lift." Valerius looked Kaelin over, his eyes cold and analytical. After a silent heartbeat, he gave a short, sharp nod. "Lead the way." They stepped into the armoured lift, surging upward before the doors hissed open onto the grand concourse. As they emerged, the shift was instantaneous. The thousands of guests recoiled in a chaotic wave of exotic biology. Valerius walked past senators with flowing feathered crests that flattened in submission. A towering lithic elder, skin like cracked obsidian, went perfectly still, its internal core dimming in a biological reflex to hide. As they walked, the festival died. Kaelin maintained his precise pace, his voice low. "The citizens have travelled months for this, Admiral. 100 species gathered to celebrate the height of our cultural achievement." Valerius's boots struck the marble with a rhythmic, heavy thud. "Cultural achievement," he rumbled. "You spend your lives perfecting the art of the party and wonder why the galaxy belongs to those who perfected the art of war." The silence that followed was absolute. They reached the private lift to the observation suite. As the doors slid shut, the vibrant colours were replaced by the pressurized gloom of the command tier. When the doors finally hissed open, they revealed the observation suite. Councillor Elara stood at the far edge of the balcony, her back to them. She was framed by the colossal hull of the Alexander, which bathed the room in a rhythmic predatory orange pulse from its launch gills. Kaelin stepped out first. "Councillor, High Admiral Valerius." He stepped aside, retreating to his station by the heavy, iridescent synth-stone doors. Valerius walked forward. He stopped several paces behind her, his eyes falling to the floor where the spilled nectar had dried into a dark blemish on the pristine marble. Elara finally turned. She looked at him, her pupils dilating as the diplomatic mask slipped, revealing the exhaustion beneath. "You've certainly made your point, Admiral. The festival is ruined. The station is tilting. I assume this is the part where you tell me it was all for my own protection." Valerius stepped closer, his heavy shadow swallowing the hem of Elara's robes. "I'm here to determine if your civilization has finally outlived its usefulness." "Usefulness?" Elara snapped, her communion marks flaring a jagged electric white. "We're thousands of worlds that you failed to turn into dust." "You survived because we let you," Valerius spat, gesturing toward the massive hull of the Alexander looming outside. "We could grind you into dust." "We built this on the ruins of your fires," Elara countered, stepping into his space and ignoring the sterile metallic scent of his uniform. "You're not a soldier, you're just a glorified killer with a god complex." "I've heard your people beg for mercy," he sneered, leaning down until they were nose to nose. "They all sound the same dying." He tapped his wrist and the station groaned as the Alexander shifted its pitch. I'll turn this station to slag and force you to watch. Ilara went cold, her marks turning a brittle, frozen white. She saw the hollow certainty in his eyes and knew it wasn't a bluff. Do it then, she whispered, her voice a raw edge of defiance. Turn it to cinder, you're just a butcher. They stood inches apart, the air pressurized by 3 millennia of hate. Valerius's thumb hovered over the final command on his haptic display. The silence was absolute. Finally, Valerius exhaled, a sound like grinding stone. He tapped a kill code into his wrist, and the aggressive orange glow of the Alexander's launch gills faded to a dull, standby hum. His gaze flickered down to the dried nectar stain on the floor. The tilting has stopped, he said, a grim smile touching his lips. We aren't crushing you anymore. Don't mistake it for an olive branch. Ilara's marks began to settle, shifting from a jagged defensive white to a deep, wary indigo. She stood her ground, even as the deck under her feet vibrated with the tension of the carrier locked onto the station's ring. A brutal way to introduce yourself, Admiral, she said, her voice dropping to a low, steady resonance. She looked at his eyes. But if you've satisfied your curiosity, there's thousands of delegates downstairs waiting for a sign that this isn't an execution. I suggest you give them one. Valerius smoothed a phantom crease in his charcoal black sleeve, the fabric absorbing the orange pulse of the ship outside. He was a man forged in war and conquest, a monolith of cold obsidian standing amidst Ilara's shimmering light. They're waiting for a lie, Counselor, he rumbled, finally turning away from the viewport. Truth is the only mercy I have left to give. I'm not asking you to provide comfort, Ilara replied, stepping toward the lift. The doors slid back, inviting the warm, artificial amber of the atrium into their pressurized silence. I'm asking you to witness the consequence of your choices. See the people you was ready to slaughter. Valerius stared at her, his expression a locked vault. He didn't offer a polite nod or a diplomatic platitude. He simply turned and walked into the lift, the heavy, rhythmic strike of his boots sounding like a countdown against the marble floor. The lift doors slid back, and Valerius stepped out into the crushing humidity of the atrium. He didn't move immediately. He stood at the threshold, his eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the brilliant gold of the triple dawn. The sudden influx of sensory data, the melodic chime of glass bells, the thick scent of star lilies, and the sheer volume of non-human life seemed to hit him like a physical wall. The delegates nearby froze. The vibrant hum of the festival hit a jagged, terrified note as the monolith of obsidian breached their sanctuary. A high-ranking heiress diplomat, wings fluttering in a panicked, involuntary reflex, dropped a crystalline data tablet. It shattered against the marble floor with a sharp, brittle crack. Valerius's hand went to the hilt of his sidearm in a blur of instinct. Kaelin's scales instantly darkened to a tactical charcoal, his hand hovering over his own weapon. The Terran shock troopers behind the Admiral shifted their weight, their armoured boots grinding against the translucent floor plates. For a heartbeat, the peace of the summit was a single twitch away from ending in a massacre. Ilara stepped forward, her communion marks flaring a steady, calming indigo that seemed to push back against the tension. She didn't look at the guards. She looked at Valerius. It's just glass, Admiral, she said, her voice a low, steady anchor. The station isn't attacking you. Valerius stared at the shattered shards for a long moment, his thumb resting on the safety of his pistol. Slowly he forced his hand to drop to his side. He exhaled a sharp, metallic breath and finally walked toward the railing of the terrace, his boots sounding like a countdown against the floor. He looked down at the sprawling, lush greenery of the lower concourse, watching the snapfires pop into harmless golden sparks. The nectar, he rumbled, his voice still carrying the jagged edge of the standoff. Kaelin mentioned a flask, from the merchant. Ilara signalled a servant who approached with a silver vessel. Valerius took it, his gloved fingers nearly obscuring the engraving. He uncorked the flask and took a long, slow draw. The liquid was thick and hot, blooming with a sun-drenched sweetness that cut through the recycled tang of his ship's air. For the first time, the rigid line of his shoulders dropped. "It tastes like a world that hasn't seen a winter in 3,000 years, he muttered. A small child with shimmering wet silk skin stopped a few feet away, clutching a dim, static orb. The boy looked at the massive, scarred man in the black uniform. "Are you the one who brought the big shadow?" The surrounding crowd went perfectly still. Valerius looked down at the child. He didn't reach for his gun this time. Instead, a grim, barely perceptible smile touched his lips. He reached into a pouch and flicked a heavy, tungsten Terran coin toward the boy. "The shadow protects the light, boy," Valerius said. "Keep that. It's made of the same metal as the ship. It'll make sure the snapfires aren't the only things that glow tonight." The child caught it, eyes wide at the sheer weight of the metal. Valerius turned back to the railing, leaning into the stone, finally allowing himself to watch the festival without a targeting reticle. Valerius stayed at the railing, the heavy coin he'd given the boy a rare breach in his armor. He leaned his weight into the stone, watching the amber light of the triple dawn play across the station's gardens. For a man who had spent 3 decades in the pressurized hum of a warship, the air of Edelgard felt dangerously soft. "He'll keep that coin until he's an old man, Admiral," Alara said, stepping to the rail beside him. "You've given him a story to tell." "I've given him a piece of a hull that has survived 3 orbital bombardments," Valerius replied, his voice still low but lacking its previous bite. "It's heavier than it looks, just like the piece you're so proud of." He took another slow draw from the silver flask, the heat of the star lily nectar settling in his chest. Below them, the festival was shifting gears as the suns dipped lower. The high-energy snapfires were fading, replaced by the deep, rhythmic pulsing of bioluminescent ferns and the slow, graceful drift of glow kites, tethered to the lower balconies. In the heart of that shifting crowd, Saran moved like a ghost. He was no longer 40 levels below. He had shed his oil-slicked maintenance coveralls for the simple muted robes of a station technician. He walked with a slight limp, blending into the sea of delegates and laborers. To Kalen's security drones, he was just another face in a sea of thousands. But Saran's eyes weren't on the flowers. He was scouting the final geometry of the grand concourse. He stopped near a cluster of glass vines, looking up at the high balcony where Valerius and Alara stood. From this distance, the Admiral was a jagged black silhouette against the gold light. Saran reached into his pocket and touched a small transmitter. The bomb was already nested deep in the station's spine, but seeing the target in the flesh made the reality of the coming fire sharpen. He wanted to see the man who thought he could protect the galaxy with tungsten and shadows. "The nectar is a fine vintage tonight, isn't it?" Saran didn't flinch. He turned slowly to see an elderly merchant, the one with skin like cracked obsidian, standing nearby. The elder was watching the balcony too, his internal core glowing with a soft, relieved amber. "It is," Saran replied, his voice a dry rasp, "a taste of a world without winter." "The Admiral seems less like a monster from up here," the merchant whispered. "Perhaps there is a chance for the summit after all." Saran looked back up at Valerius. He saw the Admiral hand the empty flask back to an attendant. He saw the way the man stood, heavy, solid, and completely unaware that the floor beneath him was already bought and paid for. "There is always a chance for things to change," Saran said quietly. "But some things only change when they are broken." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before the merchant could respond. He had seen what he needed. The geography of the slaughter was perfect. As the final sun slipped below the horizon, the atrium transitioned into the violet hour. The atmosphere cooled and the music of the glass bells slowed to a meditative chime. Valerius finally pushed off from the railing. The nectar was gone, and the brief window of relaxation was closing. He looked at Ilara, the professional mask sliding back into place. "The night is over, Counselor. I've seen your garden. I've tasted your peace. Now I require the quarters your people have fortified for my arrival. I trust they meet Terran security standards." "Kalen personally oversaw the encryption of the tier, Admiral," Ilara said, gesturing towards the western wing of the suites. "You'll find them adequate, even for a man who sleeps in the heart of a carrier." Valerius signaled to his shock troopers, who snapped to attention behind him. He walked toward the private lift, his boots striking the marble in that rhythmic, persistent countdown. As the doors hissed shut, he caught one last glimpse of the festival lights, a sprawling sea of colour that he intended to see one last time before the morning's business began. In his suite, Valerius sat watching the shadows of the Alexander drift past his window. He was a guest for now, but in his mind he was already calculating the trajectory of the first shot. He spent the final hours of the night disassembling and cleaning his sidearm by touch, his eyes never leaving the slow, rhythmic patrol of his ship's drones outside the glass. When the violet hour eventually surrendered to the clinical artificial white of the station's morning cycle, he finally stood. He had not slept a single second. With his sidearm holstered and his coat buttoned to the chin, he prepared to leave the room. Valerius marched down the grand concourse with a 4-man security detail in tight formation behind him. Their boots echoed sharply against the marble floors, now bright with the first light of the triple dawn. Ilara was waiting near the ballroom entrance, her robes shimmering, but she stopped when she saw the expression on his face. "Admiral, good morning," she said, stepping into stride with him. "Did you manage to get any rest, or was the suite not to your liking?" Valerius didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the doors ahead, his pace so fast she had to hurry to keep up. "Admiral?" she pressed. He stayed silent, his jaw set. Ilara slowed for a fraction of a second, watching the rigid way he moved. There was a restless, aggressive energy coming from him that hadn't been there yesterday. He looked less like a diplomat and more like a man walking into an ambush. "You're agitated," she noted, her voice dropping. "Something is wrong?" "The station's power grid was fluctuating all night," Valerius finally said, his voice a low growl. "And the ventilation in the residential sector is cycling at 3 times the standard rate." Ilara frowned, her communion marks flickering a confused indigo. "The life support is automated. It adjusts for 1,000 different species. There are always minor fluctuations in the output. You're overthinking the technical data." "I've spent 30 years on starships, Counselor. I know the difference between a system adjustment and a manual override," Valerius said. He leaned towards her, his voice cold and flat. "Someone was rerouting power in the subdecks while you were sleeping." As the heavy synth stone doors of the grand ballroom hissed shut, the summit's polished exterior became a cage. Inside, the high-level delegates smoothed their robes. Outside, the station was being carved up with surgical cruelty. In the south ring, a station security officer caught a crew moving heavy crates that weren't on the manifest. When he reached for his comlink, he was dropped by a single muffled shot to the chest. They didn't hide the body. They left it slumped against the wall as a warning to the next patrol. Down in the administrative corridors, Saran's teams operated on a simple binary logic: cooperation or a bullet. They swept through the diplomatic offices, herding junior clerks and translators toward the cargo lifts at gunpoint. Those who froze in terror were dragged. Those who screamed or tried to bolt were executed on the spot. A senior envoy's assistant tried to trigger a manual alarm and was silenced by a short, disciplined burst of fire that left the office walls painted in red. The survivors were shoved into windowless service alcoves, bound with industrial cable ties, and left in the dark, stepping over the bodies of their colleagues to get there. On the station's security monitors, the board was beginning to hemorrhage terminal red. Life sign failure alerts and unscheduled door cycles flooded the local nodes. In the server basements, Saran's hackers were frantically deleting the digital trails of the bloodbath, but they were barely keeping the ballroom's internal feed clean. The grand ornamental doors of the summit hall were shoved back on their tracks as Valerius stormed inside. He bypassed the Obsidian Council table, ignoring the protocol of the seats and heading straight for the center stage. His four-man security detail fanned out, rifles held at a predatory low ready, claiming the floor before the morning session could even begin. The delegates shifted in their seats, the hushed murmurs of the peace negotiations dying into a sharp, confused silence. "Admiral Valerius?" Elara stood, her marks flickering a pale, agitated violet. "We are only just beginning the opening statements. What is the meaning of this?" Valerius didn't answer her. He reached the podium and with a heavy one-handed shove sent the presiding speaker stumbling off the dais. The microphone screeched against the floor, a jagged sound that tore through the room's composure. "Look at yourselves," Valerius growled into the mic. He slammed a data slate into the console, and the grand holographic displays overhead erupted into a mosaic of slaughter. His eyes scanned the tiers, cold and hollow. "There are terrorists in your corridors and corpses in your vents. You sat here talking while the floor was being painted with blood." "This is a fabrication," a delegate shouted, leaning over the railing. "A Terran ploy to—" The screens overhead flickered, displaying the undeniable truth. Security officers with their throats cut in the maintenance tunnels and a line of hostages being beaten into a cargo bay. "The security of this station is a failure," Valerius snapped, cutting the delegate off. "Soran," he interrupted, his voice dropping to a low simmer as he looked directly toward the technicians' gallery. "Step out. Now." The room went cold as Soran stepped forward from the shadows, flanked by his team. They drew weapons and moved to seize the delegates. As a terrorist lunged for Elara, Kalen moved in a blur of scales and steel. He intercepted the man driving a blade into the gap of the terrorist's chest plate, but as he turned to engage a second attacker, a pulse round caught him in the side. The kinetic impact threw him back against the council table. He snarled through the pain, clutching a blooming burn on his ribs as blood slicked his hands. The Alexander executed a combat emergency separation, its massive engines roaring as it pulled away before the gravity anchors had a chance to release, collapsing the hall as the entire docking pier was ripped out of the station's side, leaving behind a jagged, venting maw. The surge of feedback instantly overloaded the local power grid. As the carrier's massive gravitational shadow retreated, the station's internal compensators flickered and died in a violent lurch, sending chairs, debris, and the bodies of the fallen into a chaotic, weightless tumble towards the screaming breach. "Secure them," Valerius commanded, pointing towards the injured Kalen and Elara. The Terran guards moved with a level of violence that made Soran's team look like amateurs. A massive, high-intensity firefight erupted instantly, the hall filling with the staccato roar of Terran rifles and the red streaks of terrorist pulse fire. Several terrorists grabbed delegates, pulling them close as human shields and screaming for the guards to hold their fire. His guards opened fire in disciplined, overlapping volleys, deliberately punching rounds straight through the cowering hostages to kill the gunmen behind them. Bodies, both terrorist and diplomat, were shredded in the crossfire, drifting into the zero-G air in a growing cloud of debris and crimson mist. Elara watched in frozen horror as a colleague she had known for years was used as a shield, only for a Terran soldier to put 3 rounds through the man's torso without a flicker of hesitation. The guards weren't looking for clear shots. They were treating the delegates as nothing more than soft obstacles in a combat zone. The realization hit her with sickening clarity. To the Terrans, there were no innocents in this room, only targets and debris. The guards lunged through the smoke. A heavy gauntlet seized Kalen by his wounded side, hauling him up with zero regard for the injury, while another guard gripped Elara by the arm. They were dragged toward the emergency airlock of the shuttle clamped to the stage's port, moving past the mangled, drifting remains of the summit's leadership. Valerius stepped off the dais, moving into Saran's space. The terrorist held the remote high, his thumb trembling on the trigger. "I'll do it. I'll core the reactor. We all burn." Valerius didn't stop. He walked right up to the remote, his face inches from Saran's. He looked at the terrorist with a weary, jagged contempt. He didn't argue, he didn't negotiate. "Bismarck," Valerius said into his comms, his gaze locked on Saran's eyes. "Fire on the station core." The Bismarck spoke. A blue lance of plasma punched through the station's wounded spine, blasting clean through the massive structure. The orbital strike cored the station, flash boiling the atmosphere as it punched a tunnel of slag through 40 levels of reinforced deck plating. The deck beneath them buckled, surging upward in a violent liquid wave. Valerius was nearly thrown, his heavy boots grinding into the warping metal as he fought for footing against the tectonic jolt. Saran was ragdolled across the room, his body skipping off the floor before slamming hard into a structural pillar at the far edge of the hall. "No!" Saran screamed, his voice a thin rasp against the roar of groaning metal. He slammed his thumb onto the detonator. The bombs triggered, but the expected cataclysm never came. The internal explosions were swallowed whole by the Bismarck's fury, pitiful sparks lost inside a sun. Denied its chance to detonate, the core's energy was siphoned away, dragged into the void through the massive, molten exit wound the plasma had ripped through the hull. Saran stared at the useless remote, his face twisting as he realized his grand sacrifice had been reduced to a footnote. The viewport disintegrated, and the roar of the vacuum became a physical weight, a deafening gale that dragged at his body and threatened to pull him into the abyss. He opened his mouth to speak, to scream a final defiance, but Valerius was already there. Saran stared at the remote, his eyes wide as he realized the failsafe had failed. He opened his mouth to speak, but Valerius moved first. Ignoring the gale and the shifting floor, the Admiral lunged across the ruin. His hand closed around Saran's throat like a vice, slamming the terrorist back against a vibrating pillar. The impact forced the remaining air from Saran's lungs, pinning him there before he could even draw a breath. The Admiral's fist collided with Saran's jaw, a heavy, muffled crack that sent the remote skittering into the white-hot canyon below their feet. Valerius didn't wait for him to recover. He grabbed Saran by the hair and forced his face towards the glowing, cored-out center of the station. "Look at it!" Valerius roared over the tectonic grinding of the hull. He drove a brutal knee into Saran's stomach, doubling him over. "That was your moment. Your history-defining fire." Valerius hauled him back up and delivered a series of rapid clinical strike that shattered Saran's orbital bone and split his lip to the chin. "Your rebellion means nothing to me, boy. You died for a spark that couldn't even light a candle." With a final unrestrained blow, Valerius sent Saran's head snapping back against the pillar. The Admiral shoved the bloodied, semi-conscious wreck against the vibrating metal, holding him there as the atmosphere screamed past them. Saran slumped, his breath a wet, rattling wheeze, his face a ruin of purple bruising and split flesh. Valerius drew his sidearm. The charcoal black sleeve of his uniform didn't even tremble as he leveled the weapon. He pressed the barrel into Saran's temple, grinding the metal against the bone. "You wanted to be a martyr," Valerius whispered, his voice a cold, sharp edge against the howling vacuum. "But you're just a failure." "Fuck you," Saran said just before Valerius pulled the trigger. Saran's body slumped to the buckled floor as Valerius holstered the weapon, without a second glance. The hall was now a vortex of debris, chairs, data slates, and blood, all being claimed by the void. Valerius stood firm, a dark silhouette against the molten heart of the station, already reaching for his comms. Valerius didn't look back at the chaos or the cowering delegates. He turned and stepped into the airlock, where his men had the prisoners secured and waiting. The heavy door slammed shut the moment Valerius boarded the shuttle, sealing out the roar of the station's death. Minutes later, the shuttle landed in the Admiral's private hangar bay. The doors cycled open, and the guards shoved a soot-covered Ilara and a wounded Kaelin onto the cold, grease-stained deck plates. They were met by a perimeter of 20 Marines with rifles leveled. Valerius stepped out, his face dusted with ash. He looked down at Ilara as she coughed the taste of ozone out of her lungs. "The station is gone, Counselor," he said, his voice as cold as the deck plates. "And so is your summit. You're no longer a diplomat. You're a liability in my custody." Kaelin snarled, his scales bristling as he tried to surge forward, but a guard slammed a rifle butt into the back of his head. Kaelin's knees hit the deck with a heavy thud, his breath hissing through clenched teeth as two more guards pinned his arms, dragging him back into line with clinical efficiency. Without looking down, Valerius turned toward the hangar's command lift. "Bring them to the bridge," he commanded, his voice echoing off the metal bulkheads. "I want them to see the cost of their peace." The bridge of the Alexander was a tomb of amber light and humming machinery. As the Marines shoved them through the blast doors, the crew didn't even flinch. For 3,000 years, no alien had breathed this air. The silence was the cold indifference of a species that had forgotten how to coexist. Valerius stood at the edge of the command dais, a dark silhouette against the massive viewport where the mangled station sat like a dying god. "Admiral, enough," Ilara pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. "Soran is dead. There's innocent people. Let them live." Valerius turned, looking at her with a weary, jagged contempt. "You think I destroyed a station because of a few insurgents?" he asked, his tone mocking her narrow perspective. "You talk about peace, while my people are bleeding on a front you can't even imagine. We don't have time for your incompetence anymore." "What are you talking about?" Ilara asked, her marks flickering a confused, sickly violet. "There is no other war—" "Exactly," Valerius snapped, cutting her off. He stepped off the dais, his boots ringing like a death knell. He moved into her space, his presence suffocating. "You call me a butcher. You treat us like monsters. But you have no idea what it takes to keep the dark at bay." "You're a murderer, Valerius, nothing more," Ilara spat, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. The Admiral's face contorted. In a flash of motion, his hand snapped out, iron fingers clamping onto the nape of Ilara's neck. He didn't just grab her, he drove her forward with a violent, bone-jarring shove, slamming her forehead against the cold, vibrating glass of the viewport. "Look at it!" Valerius roared, his breath hot against her ear. Ilara gasped, her eyes forced open against the transparency. The station was already a nightmare. It wasn't the shining beacon of unity she had arrived at. It was a mangled skeleton of twisted girders and venting gas. Great, jagged rents had been torn through the primary hull, and the atmosphere was screaming into the void in frozen crystalline plumes. Debris, shards of hull plating and the unidentifiable remains of the docking ring, swirled around the station like a shroud of grave dirt. It was a dying beast, broken and bleeding, yet thousands were still visible through the flickering lights of the secondary rings, trapped in a cage of dying metal. "No!" Kaelin shrieked from the center of the bridge. Seeing the Admiral lay hands on Ilara ignited something primal. He exploded upward, the sound of his shoulder popping out of its socket, echoing as he tore one arm free from the Marines. He lunged, claws raking toward Valerius's back, but the butcher's men were just as clinical as their leader. A heavy boot shattered into Kaelin's ribs, folding him in half. A second Marine slammed him face first into the deck, grinding a boot into the back of his neck until his scales bled. Valerius didn't even look back at the scuffle. He merely turned his head towards the tactical station. "Open fire," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal simmer. "Slag it all." "Please," Ilara sobbed, her fingernails screeching against the glass in a futile attempt to reach the doomed station. "It's already broken! Haven't you done enough? Let them live." "Fire," he ordered, his voice final and absolute. The Agincourt and Bismarck spoke in unison. The triple-barreled siege batteries erupted, lancing the void with beams of concentrated blue plasma. Where the beams connected, the already wounded station turned white-hot and liquefied instantly. "You will watch, Counselor," Valerius hissed, leaning his weight into her to keep her pinned. He forced her to watch as the broken girders and the huddling survivors within them became a swirling mass of molten runoff. The plasma boiled through the secondary rings, turning the grand architecture into incandescent sludge that dripped into the vacuum like cooling droplets of glass. Behind them, the guards hauled a broken Kalen up to his feet, forcing his eyes toward the viewport. Together, the two prisoners were violated by the sight, forced to participate in the execution of their own hope. When the glow finally faded into vitrified cinders, Valerius stayed there for a second longer, his presence looming over Elara, making her feel the absolute weight of his dominance. Then he shoved her away. Elara hit the deck plates beside Kalen, her spirit extinguished, her marks a sickly faded violet. She was hollowed out, staring at the empty space where her world had just been melted. Valerius stood over the ruins of the diplomats and the station alike. "Set a course for Earth," he commanded, his voice returning to a terrifying mechanical calm. "Maximum burn." He finally turned, his gaze lingering on the first prisoner's humanity had taken in 3 millennia. "You wanted to see the heart of the United Terran State, Counselor. I hope it's everything you feared." The Alexander's bow-mounted grave anchors flared with a blinding violet intensity, punching a jagged wound into the subspatial layer. The ship groaned, a deep, rhythmic shriek of tortured mass, as the carrier forced itself into the breach. Metal screamed against the friction of non-existence as the Alexander surged forward into the dark, vanished into nothing, and the stars outside the viewport stretched and snapped,